Ukraine and Russia are set to hold their first face-to-face peace talks in more than 2 weeks in Istanbul. Joining us is Lord Ricketts, former permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office and former British permanent representative to NATO. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. Let's talk about that poisoning. First of all, alleged poisoning. The Americans are pouring a bit of cold water on it, but there is, previous, obviously, from Russia on poisoning people. How concerned should those taking part in the peace talks be?
I think they'll want to be very careful indeed. I mean, we don't know what happened. It's quite mysterious. The problem is it could well have happened because, as you say, the Russians have a long track record, a kind of morbid fascination with poisons and chemical weapons. So it is entirely possible that somebody made an effort to disrupt this informal mediation, which is, I think, what Abramovich and others were trying to do. So, yeah, I'm sure the Ukrainian negotiators in Turkey and indeed the Turkish hosts will be being extremely careful.
Yeah. What's your advice to them, people taking part in peace talks with the Russians?
Well, I think depend on your Turkish hosts, I think, today. This is an initiative by President Erdogan. I'm sure he will do everything possible to keep everybody safe at the venue. But it is a very, very depressing conclusion that you can't trust Russian negotiators and sit down with them without worrying that there might be some awful poisoning to be done.
What sort of steps would you take, my lord, if you were taking part in peace negotiations with face-to-face with a Russian entourage?
I think I'd stick with the Turkish-supplied nibbles and water and stay off anything else.
Very good advice. Talk to me about President Zelensky. He was talking, I think, on Sunday night, and he says that he's now willing to discuss neutral status in exchange for peace. How should we interpret that?
I think everybody wants this terrible war to be over, and we'd all love to think that negotiations could produce a breakthrough soon in the ceasefire. And I've absolutely no doubt that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian side are totally sincere. But I'm really wary of the Russians here. I don't honestly see that the conditions are there for a meaningful ceasefire. I think it's brave of President Zelensky to face up to the fact that Ukraine is not going to join NATO anytime soon. He's interested in security guarantees from the major powers and a neutral status for Ukraine, possibly with the right to join the EU. All these are important, but they're frankly secondary issues. The key thing is what happens to this territory that Russian forces have occupied. I do not believe that Putin will be willing to give up places like Mariupol once they do hold it firmly. That's on the corridor between the east, which Russia already controls, and the south and the Crimean Peninsula. I'm afraid his minimum objective is to hold the territory that he's now occupied. That requires Ukraine to accept, effectively, the partition of their country. And I just find it very hard to imagine that any Ukrainian government could do that. So I'm pretty skeptical about the outcome of these talks, although it's a good thing people are talking.
Yeah, even though the alternative is the pictures that we've just been looking at where parts of Ukraine are literally being bombed into oblivion. Peace talks mean that both sides have to give.
Yes, they do. But they mean that Ukraine would have to be prepared to give up large slices of the country, which would be a kind of reward for Russian conquest and occupation. I think it's perhaps more likely that at some point the fighting will diminish, that there'll be some sort of truce and an uneasy partition across a line of separation, neither side accepting that as the outcome. That might be a help for Ukrainian citizens and enable humanitarian help and so on to them, but it will be unstable and it will guarantee that fighting will flare up again in the future. I don't want to predict that, but I think that's probably more likely than a signed and sealed peace deal any time in the foreseeable future.
Diplomacy all important in peace talks, especially when you're dealing with a country like Russia. How helpful was President Biden's comments at the weekend when it seemed that he was suggesting that regime change in Russia was the only option?
Well, I think he'd done extremely well on this visit to Europe. He'd had a series of summits in Brussels, I think, which he'd played brilliantly. I think the alliance feels stronger as a result. Personally, I think that remark about effectively meaning regime change in Moscow was a mistake, because I think we need to keep the focus on ending this war and leave the future of President Putin to the Russians. I think putting President Putin in a corner, feeling that the objective of the West is to oust him, will only make things more difficult. And I know that his comments have been kind of corrected a sense of perhaps going a bit further than he intended in those remarks. I think the real thing is to get this war over. And I think declaring our objective is to oust President Putin is a mistake.
OK, my lord, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you for sparing the time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.